It is really good to be here with you tonight, and it sounds a bit odd, doesn't it, saying you love dogs in your bio, but I feel like it's got to be genuine, got to be honest. I just love dogs. As Luke said, I was born in Perth. I moved to Derby in the northwest of WA. I lived there for 5 years, and after school I studied chemical engineering. And fun fact for some of you guys here, I broke a 10-year friend zone with my wife before we started going out. So if there are any of you stuck in that dark, dark place, come and chat to me afterwards. At uni, I was one of only a couple of Christians I knew of in my course of 120 chemical engineers. And a lot of my course mates were smart, articulate, lovely people from all different worldviews. And so that really made me think through the big questions of life, worldview things. Most importantly of all, is Christianity true? And so I went on to study these things a bit further at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, as Luke said, and I just completed a Master's in Divinity at Trinity. So I need to say up front, I don't have all the answers. I'm sorry. I'm by no means an expert, but I'm happy to share with you some of the things that helped me as I investigated these things for myself. And so tonight, I suppose we're doing a bit of a survey of the non-Christian sources for the historical Jesus. It won't go too deep into the veracity of the sources, as we won't have time, but hopefully it's a good start. When I was younger, my mum put up with a lot from us four boys, and I remember one of the roughest episodes my two older brothers put her through was about 15 years ago. My kid brother Jesse was only about 2 years old, and Jesse's the baby of the family. He was always keen to join in with whatever his older brothers were doing. Now, you need to know about Jesse, he was a bold baby. Now, I don't just mean bold in the sense that he was fearless. I mean bold in the sense that he just didn't grow hair, strangely enough, for the first few years of his life. And around the same time that Jesse's growing his first head of hair, my oldest brother Luke had struck a deal with Dad that if he got an A in physics, then he could shave Dad's beard off. And this is kind of a big deal for us kids, you know. We haven't seen Dad without a beard before. And I guess this is argument one for the existence of God. My older brother Luke did get an A in Year 11 physics. And he got to shave Dad's beard off. And it started this weird craze where he's like, what can I shave next? And so they grabbed Jesse and brought him to the bush outside with some extension cords and shaved him down to a buzz cut all over his head. Now, my mum was unaware that any of this was happening. She stumbles across this extension cord. She sees it plugged into the wall, it trailing off into the bush, and so naturally she's worried. So she follows this extension cord out there and finds this pile of my little brother Jesse's white blonde hair on the ground, and she was devastated. Well, there isn't much point to that story other than to say there are times when we follow the evidence where it leads, the outcome or the thing we find might be uncomfortable. But I do think we need to be a little bit willing to do the same with investigating the claims of Jesus. I recently saw some classic clickbait on a uni-led Facebook article, and it had this title, that Jesus Christ wasn't actually crucified according to long-lost Bible pages. Now, these titles can be unsettling for Christians and exciting for anti-theists at the same time, so it is worth doing a bit of investigation to see how much validity there is to these claims. Now, when I got to uni, I had a good experience of Christianity from my parents, as Luke said, but I was willing to move away from it, I guess for self-indulgent reasons, if the evidence didn't stack up. The primary reason I thought that anyone should embrace Christianity is if it's actually true or not. And so I cared deeply about whether or not it was true. And I also wrestled with the fact that I couldn't account for life having objective meaning without the existence of God. If we're just here by accident, then what reason is there to not only be here in the first place, but to keep going when things get painfully hard? John Templeton makes this remark. He says, "Wouldn't it be strange if a universe without purpose accidentally created humans who are so obsessed with purpose?" Now, I believe in order to be happy, you do need a sense of purpose. More clinical psychologists are recognising this. The common approach used to be to get through tough times, you need hope. They're now realising an even deeper sense of purpose helps. But I don't think you can have purpose without intentionality. And you can't have intentionality without a personal cause of the universe. I was watching the film Unbreakable with Samuel L. Jackson, and he says to Bruce Willis's character, "Do you know what the scariest thing is? to not know your place in this world, to not know why you're here. And I think a lot of Aussies are kind of stuck in that spot, to not know their place or their purpose. See, if God doesn't exist, then life has no ultimate purpose and therefore no meaning. We're just here by accident. But I don't think that people can existentially live without meaning or purpose. We're purpose-oriented beings, and we each look for meaning in one thing or another, following different traditions or teachers that offer something we regard as meaningful. And so onto the scene comes Jesus of Nazareth. Now, in 2013, you'll see on the slide there, Time magazine ran an article on the most significant figures in history, and Jesus was ranked number 1 by a country mile. This wasn't done by Christians, this was done by secular people working for Time magazine. You can Google that article, it was done in 2013, and you can see their reasoning. They were working, some scholars from Cambridge. I think you can make the case quite easily that Jesus is the most influential person of human history, and he does refuse to go away. So it's worth asking, who was Jesus? Could this story about him be elaborated or exaggerated over time so that what we have now has very little resemblance to the original? And this question matters because Christianity isn't an abstract set of ideas to just be applied to life, but it's grounded in real historical claims. At the heart of the New Testament are claims about things that are meant to have happened in Palestine between 5 BC and AD 30. And so my question is, how can we get to know him? Well, I think to get around an ancient figure, you need to get to the ancient sources. And so we're going to look at some of these sources. The New Testament documents are incredibly well preserved, eyewitness testimony. But what about non-Christians? Did Jesus register? Did they write about him? New Testament scholar, apologist, philosopher, William Lane Craig makes the comment that Jesus is referred to in a range of sources, both inside and outside the New Testament. He says Christian, Roman, Greek and Jewish sources. This is remarkable when you consider what an obscure figure Jesus of Nazareth was. He had at most a 3-year public life as an itinerant Galilean preacher, and yet we have far more information about Jesus of Nazareth than we do for most major figures of antiquity. So we're just going to survey some of these brief sources from Greek, Roman and Jewish sources to see if they confirm some of these key facts we find about Jesus in the biblical material. And I guess my goal isn't to give you some special, extra information about Jesus that you can't find elsewhere, but to just look at what we do have. And so firstly, did Jesus even exist, responding to this Unilad Facebook article? Well, that Jesus existed is the consensus view of academics in ancient history, both skeptic and Christian. Alana Nobbs and Edwin Judge from Macquarie University point out that very early Christian sources and several non-Christian and even hostile sources attest to the existence of Jesus in 1st century Palestine. And then they say this puts his existence beyond reasonable doubt. Now, it's interesting they said beyond reasonable doubt because there are people that doubt it. But from their expertise, they've said it's not reasonable to doubt it. In 2011, John Dixon put out a challenge. He said, if anyone can find a full professor of classics, ancient history or New Testament in any accredited university in the world who thinks Jesus never lived, I will eat a page of my Bible. Now, it's been over 6 years since he first tweeted that, and John Saffron retweeted it to his 60,000 followers. And John Dixon said, my Bible still remains intact. Now, we won't look at the Gnostic Gospels in this presentation due to a few reasons. Firstly, the Gnostic Gospels aren't written as historical narrative fashion. They're mystical in their approach, mostly focusing on these post-resurrection discourses of Jesus. They're not really interested in his life or deeds or history per se. They're late. They're from mid to late 2nd century, and therefore they're well after the New Testament Gospels. And so even though they have apostles' names attributed to them, they were not the work of the apostles. They don't have signs that they were accessing information about the early Jesus tradition. And the Gnostics who wrote them were writing around the same time as the 2nd century Apologists, a group of Christian writers, Ignatius, Irenaeus. And so they do give us more of a window into the culture than into the historical Jesus. The Gnostic Gospels are helpful, though. They give us a bit of an example of how things can actually have mythological development designed to reinforce a particular worldview. So we see Gnosticism, this mindset that matter was bad and spiritual was good, etc., kind of retold through the Jesus narrative. So how close can we get to Jesus via Greco-Roman sources? Well, they tell us some really interesting info from a non-friendly perspective, and at the very least they indicate that Jesus was a real historical figure, because some of them just reference him in passing. And so our first piece of evidence, I suppose, is looking at a bit of archaeology. And so we'll do a bit of digging. This is from Rome, the power centre of Jesus' world, where we find this piece of anti-Christian graffiti scratched into a guardhouse on Rome's Palatine Hill. So if you look at the picture there, don't worry, I'll enhance it in a bit, but this is actually a piece of graffiti scratched into a bit of limestone. It's called the Menos graffiti. It's about 2nd or 3rd century CE, and if you see the next slide, what it shows is a picture of a man worshipping a donkey-headed figure on a cross. And in poor Greek, the insult underneath it reads, Alexamenos sebete theon, which translates to, I've put it below, Alex worships his God. And so it doesn't tell us anything directly about Jesus by name, but it tells us that already by 2nd century there's a group of people in Rome worshipping a crucified man, which the Romans thought of as ridiculous. There's another Greek intellectual called Celsus. He was living and writing at the same time as the Gnostic authors. Again, this is late 2nd century. He was no fan of Jesus, and he makes 2 controversial claims about Jesus, saying that there was this suspicious nature of his birth, and he thinks it's a Roman soldier father called Pantera. And he says that the miracles attributed to Jesus were mere Egyptian sorcery. So this is from the late 2nd century. It doesn't have a lot of historical weight, but it does give us an idea of how the Greek intelligentsia viewed the reports about Jesus. Not very well. And so a bit closer on the timeline, this is from early 2nd century, about 114 AD. The Roman historian Tacitus, who was the greatest of the Roman historians, published his Annals of Imperial Rome, and he makes mention of Jesus in passing. What he has to say isn't so flattering, but it doesn't prevent him from giving us some salient details. He says, Christians derive their name from a man called Christ, who during the reign of Emperor Tiberius had been executed by sentence of the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. The deadly superstition, thus checked for the moment, broke out afresh not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world meet and become popular. See, Tacitus was no fan of Christianity, but that didn't prevent him from recording some helpful details about Jesus, when and where he lived, that he was known as Christ, and the circumstances of his death. Now this is quite significant because Jesus was relatively unknown in Palestine during his lifetime. So the fact that there are any non-Christian references to him is actually quite staggering. Some people think there should be more, but it's surprising he even gets a mention, because Roman historians had very fixed ideas of what was and wasn't appropriate for histories to contain. Pontius Pilate doesn't even get that much written about him. So Jesus wouldn't have been very interesting in a minor province, but he only became interesting because of this fire in Rome that Nero then blames on the Christians. So Tacitus's seeming approval of Jesus' crucifixion fits with what you would expect from Roman historians, because any behaviour that they thought was revolting or was seditious needed to be stomped out. So that's kind of how he gets a mention from Tacitus. But also in his life, Suetonius is writing about the Emperor Claudius in 54 to 68 AD, and there's a possible reference to Jesus in his writing. He says the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, so Claudius expelled them from Rome. So a lot of scholars think that this is a reference to Jesus, to what would be Christus in the Greek, but it was a misspelling. And so it shows the typical attribution of problems to probably Jewish or Christian missionaries either in 41 or 49 AD. We actually see this in Acts 18:2, which speaks of the departure of Priscilla and Aquila from Rome. Next up, there's a guy called Gaius Plinius Secundus. You'll see a photo of him. He was governor of Bithynia from 111 to 113 AD. He's known as Pliny for short. He was stationed in what's now northwest Turkey, and he wrote to Emperor Trajan basically asking whether he should kind of keep disciplining or killing the Christians, because he does some investigation and he goes, all I can see them doing is, look, the sum total of their guilt was no more than the following: they met regularly before dawn on a determined day and sung a hymn to Christ as to a god. And so this doesn't give us tons of info, but what it does confirm that already by AD 110, Christians were worshipping this man Jesus as divine. We've got an interesting little source actually next up from a guy called Marabar Serapion. He's a father who's languishing in prison. He's writing a letter to his son shortly after the Romans sacked Jerusalem in AD 70, and he's writing about AD 75. And his letter is in existence. It's in the Syriac collection of the British Library. And he finds some kind of comfort in the fact that he's being persecuted, but all the great teachers of the past have been persecuted. So he names Pythagoras or Socrates, and then he gives an example of an unnamed wise king of the Jews who was executed. He says there, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. But the wise king did not die altogether. He lived on in the teaching which he'd given. And the figure isn't named, so we can't be absolutely certain that this is referring to Jesus. But since no one Jewish man fits the description of teacher, king, and martyr, mainstream historians take this as a passing reference to Jesus. If Marabar Serapion meant someone other than Jesus, it's hard to see. His failure to mention the name implies that Jesus was already wise enough for people to get these 6 traits about him. What can we get from all this? Well, it's by no means exhaustive. There's a few more references from Suetonius and Thales. But here, as far back as AD 75, from Greco-Roman sources alone, we can already determine the following: that he existed historically, that he was known as a teacher, that he was from Palestine, that he was a supposed king or Christ, that he was worshipped as divine, and that he was executed by the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. But Romans and Greeks weren't actually the only ones to write about Jesus. Jews also mention him. After all, Jesus was a Jew. So next up we have a reference to Jesus from a guy called Flavius Josephus, which is published in the History of the Jews. There's a reference to him in the 18th and the 20th books, and they're just 2 little references to Jesus. The first, from 18, which there's a lot of discussion surrounding, is on the screen there, so you can read through it, and we'll discuss some of its contents. He says, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. It's strange for a Jewish historian to write that. And when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to the cross, those who had first come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the 3rd day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and countless other marvellous things about him. And the tribe of Christians so called after him has still not disappeared to this day. Now you may wonder why a Jewish historian would describe Jesus as the Messiah, and so do many scholars. One copy even has that he was perhaps the Messiah, or that it was reported that he appeared alive. But it is still widely recognised by most scholars that this 1st century Jewish aristocrat's reference to Jesus is, I guess, there is a historical core to it that may have been improved by a later Christian copyist. Interpolations were actually quite common in ancient manuscripts, But virtually everyone writing on the topic today, bar a few, agree that this paragraph couldn't have been a complete Christian invention. So the fact that Jesus describes on the next slide, I've highlighted a few things that may have been suspicious. The fact that he described him as a mere wise man or a doer of strange deeds is not something that a Christian propagandist would have employed. But there are some things that you wouldn't have expected Josephus to say. So it strains belief to think that a Jew penning such a thing would say that he was the Christ, or that the scriptures prophesied that he was going to come, or that he did rise on the third day. But there are things in there, though, that give it a ring of authenticity. It would be strange to think of a Christian completely fabricating it and then saying at the very last sentence, the tribe of Christians so named after him has still not disappeared to this day. Kind of giving this impression that it should be on its way out. And there's a second reference to Jesus in book 20 of Josephus' account, where he's just talking about the stoning of a man named James, who is the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. Now, the so-called phrase is consistent what you would expect from Josephus, saying the so-called Christ, and it does indicate authenticity. There's really no suggestion that there was tampering there. And so around about the same time as Marabar Serapian's writing and Josephus's writing as well, Jesus is being hailed by some as Ho Christos, the Messiah, to use a Hebrew saying, or God's anointed one. So just from the non-Christian references to Jesus, we can know the following. It should be up there on the screen. We know that he existed historically, that we know his mother's and his brother's names from sources, Mary and James. There's ambiguous nature of his birth, where you can pinpoint the time and place of his work, 26 to 36 AD, or CE, sorry, anyone that upsets. That he had fame as a teacher or miracle worker, or to put a negative spin on it, sorcerer. That he had Roman and Jewish people involved in his trial. He was hailed by some as king or Christ or Messiah. He was executed by the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, and Jews, Greeks and Romans were all worshipping him as divine. So, just making sure I'm in the right point in my notes. So we can know a lot about him just from these kind of corroborating sources, but we don't know anything about what he taught or what he stood for or what ultimately led him to the cross. And so it's worth asking, what did Jesus say about himself? And if you want to answer that question, that points you to an even earlier source for knowledge of Jesus. Now, some people tend to reject the New Testament documents because they're Christian sources, but that's not how historians see the matter. I'm from Perth Hills. I went to school in Midland. I survived. I spent many mornings at Midland train station. And around Midland, there's someone who is somewhat of an urban legend, a local legend. His name is Mad Dog. There's a picture up there on the screen of him. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of Mad Dog before. But he's a guy who rides around in stubbies on an old bike with no footwear, and he barks at cars if they get too close or cut him off. And he's even got a Facebook appreciation page, right? Now, the thing about Mad Dog, his real name's Adrian, is that there are loads of stories about who he is and where he came from. There's all these kind of myths. Some claim that he was a millionaire who lost everything when his family died in a car accident. That's widely circulated. Others say that he was a genius who got disenchanted with life and then just gave up. There's tons of stories. And I remember my mum telling me one time that she ran into Mad Dog in Coles. And I'm like, oh, you ran into Mad Dog. He's like a genius who went crazy. And Mum's like, he's not a genius. He can't even read. And I was like, what? She's like, yeah, I was in Coles and he's come up to me in the freezer section and he's asked me to read the back of a packet of something. And so I was like, oh, that kind of debunks the genius myth. And then I kind of was thinking about it a few months ago. So I called my mum back up and I was like, Mum, did Mad Dog ask you for help reading the back of that packet because he couldn't read or because he had bad eyesight? And she went, oh, geez, that's a good question. I don't know. And so I thought, well, how could I find out? I'd actually have to ask someone who knew Mad Dog. I'd need to verify the witness and the source of their information. And so don't do what you can do and go to the Facebook discussion group where you'll see all these theories about Mad Dog. So there's a few slides up there. He's a mad guy. I had to bleed out a lot. But if you knew what this bloke lost and what he went through, you'd be mad too. 30 years ago, he lost his missus, his kids, everything, leave the poor guy alone. And I love this guy below. He's like, give us details. And everyone, is commenting that he's an icon. Or this other guy, Kalen, is like, he used to be a millionaire. And even on the next slide, you'll see some more, comments about Mad Dog. He used to terrorize women and children in cars because he'd ride his bike next to them, bark at them. It's just like, it's seriously a good 20 minutes entertainment if you ever get bored to go to Mad Dog's appreciation page. But as I was thinking about this, and I talked to my mum about, her meeting him in Coles, I thought, how could you actually get to know him? I thought, well, to get to know him, you'd need to get to know the people, either get to know him, or if he's not around, get to know the people who are closest to him. And on the next slide, there's a very interesting comment on this appreciation page, where this guy says, I actually know him, even though he's not talking to me ATM, which I kind of feel like gives it a ring of authenticity, right? And the myth that he was driven insane because his family died is total crap. Now, unfortunately, that comment didn't get as many likes as all the other ones that were as fantastical. But I think if you want to get to know someone, getting to know the people closest to them is the best way to go about it. Now, most skeptics would say, hang on a second, the New Testament documents are totally inadmissible because they're written by religious people or people with an agenda, and therefore they're too biased to tell us anything useful. But historians don't see it that way. They take bias into account, and they know that it doesn't undermine everything that someone tells you. We wouldn't actually have a legal system functioning if we dismissed evidence from anyone close to the subject of investigation. See, bias may colour the evidence, but it doesn't discredit it entirely. So Mad Dog's friends, family and neighbours could give us a closer, more reliable bit of information about the guy. It may be coloured, but it doesn't mean it's all false. So this demand that we hear from people sometimes that there needs to be more sources about Jesus from a non-Christian perspective is odd, because it's surprising that we have what we do have, but also just do a little bit of a thought experiment with me. If you lived during the 1st century CE, during the lifetime of eyewitnesses, and you were interested in Jesus and Christianity, and you investigated all these things, and you found out that it was actually true, that Jesus did miraculous deeds, you heard some of the things he taught, you knew that he was publicly crucified, that there was an empty tomb, that there were people who claimed to have seen him alive, this movement just kind of exploded, even under persecution. If you did your investigation and became convinced that that was all true, and you kind of wrote this down as a record, would you be a Christian or a non-Christian source? Just see the kind of... You're assuming it's wrong when you say, I want a non-Christian source from the 1st century that doesn't say the same thing as the Christian source. Because you're assuming it's false from the get-go. See, because if the things that happened actually happened, as the gospel writers say, they're multiple independent attestation, and someone wrote this down, they'd be considered a Christian source. So it's very unlikely that someone would write things about his miracles, his teaching, his execution, his resurrection, if they didn't accept these things to be true. And because Jesus was a relatively unknown, obscure figure early on, we shouldn't expect actually to have tons of people writing about him until the movement gets bigger. Also, just a little side note, it's estimated that about 5 to 10% of people were kind of literate during that time. Some estimates are as high as 15, but it doesn't go higher than that. So if something really important happened, as part of a kind of oral culture, if you wanted to tell people, you wouldn't write it down. It's kind of like wanting to get a message now to your friend in the UK urgently, as quick as possible, and writing them a letter and sending it in the mail. You know, we all know how much you trust Australia Post. But don't put that online. No. So if they're concerned with getting the information out, writing it down wasn't necessarily the best way of making it widely available. And so the fact that we see these Gospels arising, 30, 40, 50 years after he died and his resurrection claims isn't actually surprising, because it started to be when the eyewitnesses were dying off and they wanted to preserve this tradition. And so as we look at the tradition, it's worth thinking, if someone's report about you would be 100% invalid just because they were close to you, so would my wife's testimony about me and what I'm like be 100% invalid because she knows me well? Well, actually, the people who know you well are probably going to say a lot of things that might not even be comfortable facts. So, for instance, the attestation that it was women who discovered the empty tomb. If you were fabricating something in first century Palestine, you would not have used women as your primary source of testimony, because their testimony wasn't valid in many courts of law. So the fact that they use women as the first witnesses probably means that it's how it actually happened. Bart Ehrman is a non-friendly, agnostic-leaning atheist, but he's actually really helpful on this point of the existence of Jesus and what we can know about him from the gospel accounts. He is a big fan of the Apostle Paul's writing because of how early it is to the Jesus tradition, and also that the Apostle Paul knew Peter and Jesus' brother James. And so if you're kind of really wrestling with this idea of Jesus' existence, or what we make of the New Testament documents, Bart Ehrman isn't actually a bad guy to read. He has some really helpful stuff. Some really conservative Christians would be really upset with a lot of things Bart Ehrman says, but there's some good responses to his comments on textual criticism from guys like Dan Wallace. You can see the debates online. There's a lot more there if you want to dig. But anyway, the sources we've looked at do confirm some important details, but they don't get us to Jesus personally. And so that's why I want to kind of make that push to consider looking at the New Testament documents. And these first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel are really interesting. He says there what his agenda is. And so you'll see on the screen that Luke kind of maps out his intentions, and he says a bit of his process. He says that many people have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. That phrase, servants of the word, is actually, it might seem redundant, but that's really significant, because what it's saying is these are people who were practicing making the Jesus message available to people. So servants of the word, meaning this is a tradition that people were keeping in circulation and making sure it was well preserved. He says, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Now that word, see where he says in verse 4, so you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. The word he used there for certainty in the Greek is asphaleia, from which we actually get the English word asphalt. What he's saying is, I'm wanting to give you something really firm and solid to use as a foundation. He's saying, the things that I want you to know about Jesus, I don't want you to just think are speculation or not something that you can actually have confidence in. I want you to have certainty of the things you've been taught. And just lastly, for some of the Christians here, so I guess I go into minister mode here, and so if you're a non-Christian, you can eavesdrop in a bit. Tim Keller made a comment a while back that I thought was really quite insightful. He said, when I stopped believing the gospel, that I'm made right with God through Jesus, he said, I become dependent on the approval of others. And in 1 Peter 3:15, a verse that everyone who loves apologetics knows, it says, always be ready to give the reason for the hope that's within you. But it actually begins by saying, first off, in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. And so if you're a Christian and you're getting into apologetics or you're interested in this for self-justification reasons, you'll get lost in frustration, you'll be upset that more people aren't convinced by your arguments, or you won't understand why everyone doesn't believe like you do. But the first step that's important that Peter says we need to know how to do is in our hearts set aside Christ as Lord. And if you're able to do that, then gentleness and respect will follow, and it will flow out of a reverence for Christ as Lord. And so lastly, I just want to make a comment on the Gospels by a really interesting source. Albert Einstein was actually interviewed in 1929, and he was asked, it's on the screen there, to what extent are you influenced by Christianity? And he says, as a child, I received instruction both in the Bible and in the Talmud. I am a Jew, but I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene in the Gospels. To which the interviewer asked, have you read Emil Ludwig's book on Jesus? And he says, yeah, Emil Ludwig's book, Jesus is too shallow. Jesus is too colossal for the pen of phrasemongers, however artful. No one can dispose of Christianity with a bon mot. So the interviewer seems surprised. You accept the historical existence of Jesus. To which he said, unquestionably, no one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates on every page. No myth is filled with such life. Now, personally, I haven't come across any specific info or data that has critically undermined my trust in Jesus as God's chosen ruler of this world, God's chosen saviour. But I wonder if in your investigation or in your thinking about Jesus, you've been willing to do what F.F. Bruce encourages his readers to do in his book on the New Testament documents. He says this, it is perhaps not superfluous to remark that before going on to consider the trustworthiness of the New Testament writings, it would be a good idea to read them. I recently heard of a young 13-year-old girl who was in trouble with the law, living on the streets in London, and someone gave her a New Testament and she got to read one of the accounts of Jesus' life. And when she did, she was staggered, and her comment was, it was as if the person of Jesus walked off the pages of the gospel and right into my life. And so I guess I just want to finish by commending to you that if you really want to get to know Jesus, get to the earliest sources, get to the eyewitness testimony of people who actually knew him. Don't check your brain out at the door. Ask good questions, but get a good look at him through those sources. Thanks for having me.